Hello, Imhotep, and welcome to this latest transmission of the Egyptian Magic podcast. I'm Mog Morgan, companion of Set and Knight of Shambhala. Please do leave feedback or queries either here or finding me on the usual social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, that is. You can send an audio message if you like, and I might even use that in the next program. Check out my several books on Egyptian magic if you can, and its connections. They're always heavily illustrated and often have the images and sources that I refer to when I'm talking to these stuffers. So it's good to have them to hand or just to refresh your memory. Anyway, in this transmission, as I call it, I'm continuing the journey into specifically Typhonian magic, but also in general Egyptian magic and magic in the wider sense. And I'm still kind of in my head looking at events and ideas that I had when I was, which I wrote in a book called Sexual Magic as Katon Shoal, which explores the secrets of sexual gnosis within the Western magical tradition. I always made a point of saying sexual magic rather than sex magic. I mean, there's a lot of books that talk about sex magic. That always seem to me a bit mechanistic. Sexual magic, I kind of feel, it maybe includes some of those things, but has a kind of more sensual aspect to it and a broader metaphorical aspect as well, which maybe become obvious as I explore that. Anyway, I should say the book, I've kind of rewritten it or corrected it, I suppose, several times over the years and added little insights, but it's still essentially the core is pretty much as it was at the end of the 1980s, with the kind of themes and obsessions that I'd like to explore. And one of those was a chapter in this book was I called the Erotic Landscape, which is, I suppose it's about places really. It's about physical places and how they kind of work. I say that magicians always have this developed sense of a spirit of place, either places that are appropriate to do magic or places that somehow crop up in magic. And this was a kind of theme that I've explored in various ways, and I think it's really underestimated and really important one, in fact. Right from the beginning, before I even kind of started writing these things, I was always interested in the phenomena of the temple, I suppose. The temple one way or another, whether that would include the church, if you're from a sort of Christian country or country with Christian background, churches are the thing. And obviously, probably one of the first things that got me going you explore churches, especially the kind of older ones, what we call the pre-Reformation ones. You explore them looking for, even when you've stopped identifying as Christian, you still explore these places looking for something, some lost mystery, and sometimes it is there. There's something there. I mean, obviously these places, I suppose we would say that it's an aspect even of the Christian mystical tradition that is sort of kind of, especially in this country, they rejected in the Puritan era when they did a lot of damage to their own temples, which is another story. So often the things you're looking for, there are only maybe a handful of places that still have this mystery. There's often some little thing there. I suppose, like a lot of people, the book by Falconelli, The Mystery of the Cathedrals, was more about European churches and cathedrals, really, where there was a tradition of encoding in these buildings certain secrets, I don't mean sort of physical books. I mean in the actual architecture of the building, it tells a story. Just on a simple level, according to his theory, the shape of even a Christian church is a cross, which is as you learn is quite a magical symbol. With if they've got a special window called a rose window facing in the east, this forms a kind of the symbol of the ankh. So it's almost like the whole church has the secret symbol of the ankh encoded in it, which may seem a bit kind of speculative, but in fact the ankh sign is probably one of the oldest Egyptian hieroglyphs still surviving and still in use, and was regularly used as a symbol by the early Christians. So it wouldn't be such a preposterous idea that this would be encoded in churches. Anyway, that's churches. But broader out from that, one looks for certain places, might be stone circles, and megalithic monuments. If you're lucky enough to travel abroad, then obviously you you find Hindu temples and Greek temples, Egyptian temples, and all the rest of it. So very early on, I developed an interest in these sort of buildings and what they could teach, and the kind of implications that they have for magic and for religion, I suppose, for spirituality in one way or another. So it's obviously something that magical people have always been interested in. They don't always admit it, but they use these things. They use it as a physical thing. There's the question of physically visiting these sites. I suppose I was lucky enough when I first got involved with this, that one of the people who was very influential on me was someone called Jessica Potter, who doesn't seem to be with us at the moment, but she taught me something about spirit of place and how one connects with it in some way, how you do that. So you go and visit, especially the Neolithic and the megalithic sites, how you can see how as you practice magic, you develop a kind of a vision, and you see the landscape as a kind of living thing, which is part of the reason why I called this chapter the erotic landscape, because it was the idea that the landscape itself becomes alive and becomes a very sensual thing as one moves through it and encounters it. And she was someone who really introduced me to that idea. And we used to visit a lot of these megalithic and ancient sites, mostly obviously in a very ruined state these days because of just through their sheer age, or some sites because of neglect as well. And often these places, these sites are located not in the most convenient place to do a meditation or any sort of ritual work. Sometimes you can, but sometimes it's more, you do a little bit there and you absorb the atmosphere and it soaks in, and then later in a more controlled environment, you remember it, you draw it to mind, and you're able to use that in one's kind of spiritual magical work. You're able to revisit it, really. It's one of the techniques of magic, is to visualize things and to kind of travel there in your head, or re-travel there. Having got a good firm image of a place, you can go back there in your imagination, in the imaginal realm, and you can look at it again, and often things that you maybe didn't notice while you were there because it was a rain, or because busloads of tourists were coming in, or whatever it was, that you can recreate it. And so actually in the book here there's sort of little drawing from Cheska, which was her kind of idealized image of a very important magical Neolithic site, which is the temple at Avebury in Wiltshire, which is quite a complicated landscape, and we used to spend a lot of time there exploring the different parts of it. And there were all sorts of things that she kind of visualized or kind of saw at that place. As I say, it's well worth visiting, and it's quite an important magical site now for a lot of people. So you can see that little drawer in there. I suppose stemming from that is the idea that all temples really, probably if you get, I mean, obviously the Christian ones, they did this as well once upon a time. They were kind of places of mystery. They weren't just a place that you sat down and listened to a sermon and sang songs, wonderful as that might be. They were heavily decorated, and they had places they have a magical crypt or a loft in which all sorts of strange encounters took place. These were one of the features of ancient churches that has mostly been removed these days. But in a sense, it's harping back to an earlier time, to a temple design from the classical world, in which temples, most of which were destroyed, obviously, by people who didn't really like this vibe. But if you go to somewhere like Egypt or India, there are many wonderful temples that are in a very, very good state of preservation, in which you can get a real idea of what the original intention was. And with a little bit of book research and all the rest, you can really piece it together. I talk quite a lot about that, how you should. You see, in the magical tradition, in the books that you'll read, which I read anyway, there's this idea that you learn all these kind of what initially seem quite strange techniques, like the meditation and your invocation and making of signs and vibration of strange words, and then you have this idea of visualization, of good imagination, of bringing things to life, and you construct an important idea, again, I was taught quite early on, is a thing called the astral temple, which is a temple of the imagination. The Imaginarium, if you like, was another name someone gave it. This is depending on your tradition, obviously if you're into the Golden Dawn type magic, then the temple tends to be as in Freemasonry, a kind of Solomonic, idealized Solomonic temple for the time of Solomon, with all the dimensions and the checkerboard floors and the pillars and all this sort of stuff. If you're maybe into chaos magic, it might be some sort of eightfold room. If you're into Tantra, it might be, or Hinduism, it might be some idealized Hindu temple. And of course, if you're into Egypt, then, which in a way this is not so common when I first started out, then you would take one of the Egyptian temples, which are also idealized. My insight, these are all imaginal buildings, right? They're kind of fictionalized in a way. But one insight putting all this stuff together was to use a real building, in a sense of, all right, it might be ruined, but you can usually get the plans and all the rest. So base your astral temple not on some completely idealized building, but on an actual building. And if you're into the Egyptian way, and also if you're into the Typhonian tradition, the one that's most fruitful, if you like, and evocative, is the temple of Seti I in Abydos, and I'll talk probably quite a lot about that in other episodes, where I'm just kind of introducing this idea. But the notion was, whatever building you use, I mean, obviously if you're into Isis, you might use another temple. The thing about the Abydos one is it's so was already quite a special place in the ancient world as a magical place, and the whole landscape around it as well is significant in terms of what you would call a kind of psychogeography, if you like, or psychic question was another name for this sort of stuff, which is not just visiting the landscape, but kind of on using the landscape as a sort of quest to guide you on a journey to some particular end. Abydos has this probably feature people didn't really understand straight away, that you have the temples, but then you have what the temples are pointing at, and it points at a place on the landscape about a couple of miles away in the west, in which there appears to be a kind of doorway in the cliff, which was thought by the Egyptians to lead into the underworld. So using this actual place, the building itself teaches you the cosmology, it teaches you the ins and outs of the magical system you're actually working with. Whereas an idealized one, you know, if you use a sort of idealized Temple of Solomon, or you know, a kind of four-square building with a door and all this sort of stuff, then, or even a grove in the woods, these are productive, but in a way you're projecting stuff onto it. It's far better if you're going to use, say, a natural place, like if you prefer a circle in the woods or something like that, then you try and familiarize yourself with a real circle in the woods, a real magical place in the woods. This has added benefits. Say it was always an obsession of mine over the years. It was quite interesting to find that this idea of the temple itself being no accident, if you like, that the temple has certain lessons built into it. So a Hindu temple, the idealized ground plan of a Hindu temple, is actually shows a figure of an image of a human being laid out in a certain posture on the floor. And in fact, this image of this human being, assuming it is a human being, I mean, I've lately come to the idea that this image of what is buried under the floor in these buildings isn't necessarily human in the accepted way of looking at these things. But whatever, just for the sake of argument, you can see this sort of diagram, this very famous diagram of the idealized floor plan of a Hindu temple, with this character sitting in a cross-legged posture that makes a square that sits underneath the floor of the temple. And this determines where all the other elements within the temple occur in the Hindu tradition. So the center of the temple will actually be called the womb or the navel of the temple in one way or another. And this image, this character under the floor in Hindu temple, is not static. As I say, it kind of revolves in their way of looking at things throughout the year. So it goes through a complete cycle. And you know, it will be facing one direction at the equinox and another direction at the next equinox, and blah blah blah. In the course of 12 months, it does a complete cycle, which is an incredibly interesting idea in some ways. And I suppose also the image of things under the floor. This is an intuition that all buildings, so once you get this idea, it's very obvious within the Hindu idea. Once you get the idea that there might be something buried under the floor, and that this might be an extremely old idea as well, the idea that entities are buried under the floor of temples. Once you open yourself up to that, you find that an awful lot of different traditions of magical buildings have this notion of something buried under the floor, whether it be in the crypt, under Hindu temples, which is, in fact, there are crypts under Hindu temples as well, which is another controversial idea, because in a way they're not supposed to be there. That I explore later. There's a kind of very interesting idea in its own right. So you have that idea. You're discovering things about the building, and at the same time it's coming into your meditation, and the building is coming to life. And given that the building is a sort of it's connected to a landscape. A building is always connected to a landscape, and a building is a sort of extension of the landscape in some sort of way. Obviously, the more neo-pagan view, they maybe like to be outside in the wilderness. That's the landscape. But this is why I say it's erotic, it's sensuous, it's alive. Which is one of the ideas of magic, is to bring things to life that were, seemed dead before. But once you understand these things, it's teaching you the secrets of magic and of life in lots of ways. The secrets of the first times as well, because the buildings kind of repeat stuff from prehistory, really, from the first moments. It's almost like the first time that, even in the Stone Ages, when people were making those images in caves, because they didn't make buildings, but they kind of depicted, the first thing they depict, apart from all the animals, are the structures, these kind of tent-like structures that they move around. Who knows? Maybe they make them, maybe they were already there. This is an important moment in our evolution, in a way, that is still ongoing. It's still repeated in our consciousness every day. There's another idea. As we go through the cycle of the day, of sleeping and waking up again, we sort of repeat, in a way, these processes, and this is a very important thing for magic. As I say, why the Typhonian thing, how this comes in, see, this is where it connects both the Hindu tradition, the Hindu tantric tradition, and the Egyptian tradition, specifically that of connected with Set, because I also already mentioned the temple of Seti I, named after he of Set, in Abydos. Even though this, on the face of it, this place is not, it's a temple of Osiris, or this is the cult center of Osiris, certainly Abydos is. But given that Osiris and the god Set have quite a lot of business to conduct together in their kind of passion mystery, if you like, their passion play, a lot of these secrets are encoded in the buildings at Abydos, one way or another, and that's kind of something we probably will have to go into in a lot of detail. It's funny that people often say, see, certain places, certain landscapes, there's always a lot of mythology, interesting mythology, connected with why a place is sacred. And why not another place? Why is one place sacred and another place is just a piece of the landscape? I mean, you can see it if you're lucky enough to go to somewhere like Stonehenge on the right moment. I wouldn't, I always thought if you go on in as part of the tour or whatever, you wouldn't get anything. It's said to be one of the most kind of disappointing tourist attractions in Britain in lots of ways. People don't see the point, and that's maybe the way the current stewards of all these buildings, they don't really want you to see the point. That would be difficult. They want you to pay and just keep it going, but they don't want you to get too much out of it. But there are these open access moments at Stonehenge, for instance, and other sites. You can go to them when you're not being shepherded in a way by people who feel they know better, and you're just there to explore the sites, say on the summer solstice. And if you're there on the right day, in terms of the weather and all the rest, so there's a clear golden dawn, you really do see the golden dawn, and also you see why it's a sacred place, because you have this incredible vista across this plain to the rising sun, and so you learn that from it. Let's say the Hindu thing, the myths there, we actually know the myths to do with the sacred places in India, the tantric sacred places. There's a core myth in a way of the core tantric myth, which is also an erotic myth, a tradition in which there's going to be a sacrifice, a ritual, but organised by Daksha and whose daughter is called Sati, and she's invited because it's her father conducting this special ritual sacrifice to come, but her husband, who is the god Shiva, he's excluded, right? He's thought to be not worthy to come to this thing. But being the god Shiva, he kind of goes anyway, and there's all sorts of trouble takes place. It's quite complex, and in a way, the process of breaking up the ritual causes all sorts of interesting things to happen, which is too complicated to go into now. I'm sure other bits. So the bit I wanted to concentrate on, though, was, of course, Sati, his first wife, who he's very, very attached to, she, I suppose, is a bit extreme in a point of view. Because of this insult to her husband, Shiva, she actually kills herself. She throws herself on the sacrificial fire. And Shiva is totally distraught about this and famously rescues her and carries the dead body all across India. And various parts of the body fall. Well, they don't fall. I mean, they decide the only way they can get the body off Shiva is for other gods to kind of dismember her. This important theme of dismemberment. They gradually dismember her until there's nothing left and bits fall at different parts in India. And wherever those parts fall, including the sexual parts and the nipples and the breasts and the hands and the lips, all these different things, wherever they fall in India, those places are always special, magically special, especially where the yoni of the goddess falls. It's very visceral, kind of sensual culture in some ways. That would be a special sacred site within India, which will be venerated now and be a huge source of pilgrimage and all the rest. Interestingly, that myth of the destruction of the sacrifice and the generation of all these magically potent places is thought to have some connection with Egyptian myth. Which again is another untold story that I've explored in lots of places, is this connection between the ancient magical culture as it existed in the late classical world between India and Egypt. So it wouldn't be so surprising, but these are the sort of things that people read it and they think, oh no, it can't possibly be true, they're so far apart. But anyway, that's apparently given us one of the examples that, because of the notion of dismemberment, because of the fact that someone is dismembered and where the parts of the body are buried, again you have this theme of burying things under the ground and under the temple, where these things are buried, these become special places of magical power. And of course in Egypt has its own very mono-myth, if you like, this very ubiquitous and powerful myth of the dismemberment of the god Osiris, which also leads to the distribution of various parts of his body across the whole of Egypt, along the Nile Valley, and these also lead to different sacred sites. And in fact at Abydos, the place that I remembered, I mentioned, his head is, he was decapitated, I suppose, which is another kind of incredibly potent theme that we will have to explore in more detail another time. But I'm just telling you, his head is kept there as a kind of fetish object in the temple. It's not there anymore, of course. Well, maybe it is, but it's lost. And this this myth of the dismemberment, myths of dismemberment in general, which occur all over the world, are a very, very potent things for ritual and for spiritual spiritual people to think about, or to experience in some way. I suppose in a way part of the magical experience is this notion of being dismembered and being remade again. It's something that occurs all over the place. I should say as well, so you've got the physical places with their history of remnants of a dismembered deity or person that is buried under the floor of these sacred buildings, which I've suggested you could reenact in your meditations and think about in the process, and that's very powerful. Obviously, it's to kind of be contrary as well. So you've got a physical thing which you then take inside, and say within the tantric tradition, which is why we kind of, again, coming back to the notion of pilgrimage, if you like. So that's something I didn't mention. Pilgrimage is an incredibly important thing in all of these paths, especially in Hinduism. The idea that you go to these sacred sites, everybody does that. We go to Egypt, we go to megalithic monuments, we go to the churches when there's no services, we go to all sorts of places, and there's a kind of sense that we're on a pilgrimage. Now, what do you do if you can't go on a physical pilgrimage? I mean, in most cases, when people go on the pilgrimage to Mecca, or when they went to Jerusalem or whatever in the medieval period, they couldn't. Maybe you could do it if you were lucky once in your lifetime, or maybe you would never do it. You rely on someone else doing the pilgrimage for you. I remember I went to a pilgrimage site in India, and before I went, people said, well, they have offerings there, you take the offerings, these laddus, and you buy a load of those, and you sort of share them out when you come back, so people can somehow participate in that process of the pilgrimage. Or you kind of, if you can't go, if you're into Hinduism and you want to kind of go into, you can recreate those sites. It's funny, you make it up in a way, you recreate them, but often you find when you recreate them, it works. They do have this kind of connection with the things you think. So you might not be able to go to the Ganges. You may call your local river the Ganges, or as I say, where I come from in Oxford, we have the River Isis. I don't think it's necessarily named after Isis, but it's a nice idea. But so you recreate these things, but the important concept as well is that you take these things within, so that you have a thing called internal pilgrimage, which is a kind of very Hindu idea, that within the body. So again, this is another thing we think about when people talk about as above, so below, as inside, so outside, which is, okay, you think of that as a Greek Hermetic idea, but it's also is very well known within the Hindu tradition as well, as above, so below idea, that what it is in your external landscape is also within your physical body. In some sense. Not obviously the whole of the physical landscape isn't inside, but there is an aspect of the physical landscape, your town and your sacred sites, that sort of exists within you. So the River Ganges would be thought of that you've got this kind of central channel that runs through the center of your body, or like you could call that the River Nile as well. And all the different places of sacred places within sacred geography of Hinduism also exists as places within your body, hence even the term chakra that people is very popular within our way of thinking. It really means a kind of circle or a clearing in the middle of a forest initially, often with secret temples in very kind of remote locations, which sometimes even are circular. That's the strange things. The very, very magical ones are circular. So the chakra means a circle, it means a clearing to make a sacred space, and it also means a circle of people. So you can see how these things, in a sense, they go round and round, like a chakra, I suppose. That you have the physical landscape that you discover, but you also discover that the physical landscape has a kind of correlation within a landscape within you, and the internal landscape is also a landscape that can be explored and that you can travel through. And not only that, but with specifically with the tantric idea, it's often a thing you don't necessarily do alone, you do with another person, so they are a landscape as well. The other person is a landscape, you're a landscape for them, and these different places interact and come together in some ways. And there's a process of even activating and installing parts of the landscape, or bringing to life and opening these things within yourself and with the other person, perhaps by even making signs and shapes on them. So, and then as you interact, you become these deities, which are the primary deities, which are initially buried underneath. They're hidden, they're suppressed, or they're kind of submerged in some ways. They're the submerged ones. And all of these ideas, one way or another, can be used in magical work and art, the kind of substance of magical work, so that the landscape and yourself becomes alive, or becomes erotic, as I called it. And this is a very productive and important element of magic and of the Typhonian tradition. Really, this is pure Typhonian stuff, really, that we'll kind of explore in more detail throughout the kind of course of this talk. There's a lot to tell. There's a lot to talk about. But this came from a particular moment in my kind of journey into this material a long time ago now, and it's always stayed with me as being important. Landscape and pilgrimage, and the magic of the temple, but not necessarily the kind of little temple you make in your bedroom or whatever, but of the imaginal temple, which is actually the real temple that you bring to life. So that was the lesson that I kind of learned at that stage. I was going to take it a bit further. It's going to go further when I kind of explore that it needed to be the things that were imagining in my head or were visualizing. They needed to connect with real places. With real landscapes. The landscape was erotic, the erotic landscape, and that was an incredible milestone, a rite of passage for me to learn that, and I hope you'll find that useful too. Anyway, that's more than enough for today, I think. And next time I'll talk a little bit more about temples, which since has been a kind of lifelong interest of mine, really, writing and exploring and understanding temples of all sorts of traditions. And I've learned, you can really learn a lot from that sort of material. So thank you for listening, and Senam Tea.